So we just want to welcome everyone to part two of the Satan and the Demons. And we are continuing on. We've just finished our homework review. So last week we ended on a cliffhanger asking who the Nephilim were, who are described in Genesis 6. And now we're exploring what were the children of these distorted heaven and earth unions. So we remember that the sons of men were cast out of heaven, and we read in Genesis 6 how these beings have sex with women, and then we read in Genesis 6 we read in Genesis 6:4 the Nephilim were in the land in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went into the daughters of humanity and they bore children to them. They were mighty warriors of ancient time, men of renown. We also hear this Nephilim mentioned in Numbers 13. So the spies gave the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out. Remember, this is the land they're looking at, saying, "The land through which we have gone, in spying it out, it is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. Then also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are from the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." So this passage from Numbers tells us about a group of people called the Nephilim who lived in the land in those days, and this word appears only one other time in the Hebrew Bible, and it helps us understand what's happening in Genesis 6. So the Nephilim are, in a nutshell, giant warriors from ancient times. So this is why the first translation of the Hebrew Bible into ancient Greek, which was around 300 to 100 BC, translated the Hebrew word Nephilim with the Greek word gigantes, which we call giant. So these giant warriors have a prominent role in the biblical stories about Israel's entry into the land promised to Abraham. So many of the cities and the kings that attacked the Israelites when they entered the land were among the offspring of these giant warriors whose origin stems back to the Nephilim. So look at Deuteronomy 9, verses 1 through 2. "Hear, Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites?" Or look at Deuteronomy 2. "The Emites used to live there, a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were thought of as the Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emites." Look at Deuteronomy 3. "We took all the towns on the plateau and all Gilead and all Bashan as far as Seleka and Edrei, towns of Og's kingdom in Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephaim. His bed was decorated with iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites." Or look at Joshua 11. "At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron to Beer and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive." Or look at 1 Samuel 7. "A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out from the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span." So you might be asking, what do these Nephilim warrior giants have to do with spiritual evil? Because remember, we're still investigating spiritual evil in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible. Now, to give you some context, some of us have heard about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there was an ancient Sumerian king named Gilgamesh. And in his mythology, in the Sumerian mythology, he was described as part human and part God, and he was also described as really tall. So, this depiction of Gilgamesh from the late Assyrian period, which is around 800 BC. So, Gilgamesh is depicted with a lion and a snake in his hands, a hunter giant. Now, Gilgamesh's legacy is likely behind the portrait of Nimrod in Genesis 10, verses 9 through 10. Nimrod, who built Babylon and Erech, which is the Hebrew spelling of Uruk, which is Gilgamesh's city. So, Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, is the introduction to the story of the flood. Remember Noah and the flood, which begins in Genesis 6:5. So, one interpretation is that we can see the flood being a form of divine justice from God. It's God's response not just to humanity's wickedness, but also specifically to the outbreak of violence and war due to the warrior giants. So the flood is God's attempt to purify the land from the innocent blood shed by the Nephilim and their violence. We are meant to see that many of the Nephilim perish in the flood. But in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, we see that the flood doesn't end their threat. As Genesis 6:4 notes, they are still around after the flood. So recall in the list of passages about the biblical giants listed above that these warriors, when we look back, all these warriors right here from this page, when we look back, we see that they went by many names. Amim, Anakim, and Rephaim. So this last title, whom many of us have not heard of before today, is interesting because it's often used in the Bible to refer to spirits of dead warrior kings. Okay, so just kind of tuck that in your mind. Rephaim in the Hebrew Bible refers to spirits of dead warrior kings. Now look at Isaiah 26. Lord our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone do we honor. They are now dead, they live no more. The Rephaim do not rise. You punished them and brought them ruin. You wiped out all memory of them. Look at Isaiah 14. The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you, all those who are leaders in the world. It makes them rise from their thrones, all those who are kings over the nations. Or look at Psalm 88. I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. I have become like a man without strength, forsaken among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more. And they are cut off from your hand. Will you perform wonders for the dead? Will the Rephaim rise and praise you? So these Rephaim, the surviving spirits in the realm of the dead, are associated with the Nephilim and the giant warrior kings whose origins go all the way back to the spiritual rebellion of the sons of God in Genesis 6, which we talked about last week. Now, in the New Testament, we also see Jude and Peter associate the Rephaim with the offspring of the sons of God and the human woman. Look at 2 Peter. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Or look at Jude, verses 6 through 7. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in the eternal bonds under the darkness for the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of fire. Now, Peter and Jude are reflecting on the Nephilim on Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And they are merging its ideas with the depictions of the Rephaim as spirits of the dead. So notice in Jude how he connects the two stories of the sons of God in Genesis 6 and the men of Sodom in Genesis 19. Because remember, last week we talked about how we had the sons of God who came down, right? And they had sex with human women, right? And we also talked about last week how in Genesis 19, how this was inverted, right? So you had the sons of God wanting to have sex with human women in Genesis 6. But then in Genesis 19, you had human men wanting to have sex with two angels. So you see, you have these inversions. That's what we talked about last week. So we can kind of see this juxtaposition. We can kind of see this parallelism. We can kind of see this connection between them. Now, we've set up all this, the Nephilim and the Rephaim, all these terms that we might not have heard before. And you might be asking, why does all this matter? Well, all this matters because these giant warrior kings, remember, who were the offspring of the human women and the sons of God, these giant warrior kings play a role in the final human and spiritual narrative of Genesis 1 through 11, which is the founding of Babylon. Once again, why does all this context matter? These giant warriors play a key role in the final human and spiritual rebellion narrative in Genesis 1 through 11 in these 12 chapters. And we see this in the founding of Babylon. So consider the two stories about the foundation of the Babylonian Empire in Genesis 10 through 11. These two stories provide multiple links, multiple callbacks to Genesis 3 and Genesis 6. So look at Genesis 10. The sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim, and Put and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Sheba and Havilah and Sabta and Ramah and Sabteka. And the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty warrior, a hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty warrior hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Now look at Genesis 11. This is another story of the founding of Babylon. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east. They found a plain and land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heavens, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So Nimrod is the grandson of Ham, who is Noah's son. And he is called a mighty warrior. Now, this word, mighty warrior, which comes from Gebar in Hebrew, is the same word used to describe the offspring of the sons of God and the human women in Genesis 6:4. So the same word used for Nimrod, this mighty warrior, is the same word used in Genesis 6, with the Nephilim. So perhaps we are meant to see the rebel sons of God are behind the founding of Babylon, as they were behind the story of Genesis 6. So Nimrod, who is associated with the giants of Genesis 6, builds the kingdom of Babylon and Erech, which is the same as the ancient city of Uruk, right? Erech equals Uruk. Uruk is just the Akkadian name, or the Sumerian name, excuse me, where Gilgamesh, the original giant king, lived. So Genesis 11 calls back and gives a complementary story of Babylon's origins. We're told the city and its temple tower were built in order to have a top in the heavens. Okay, remember the story of Babylon? The Tower of Babel, they're trying to build up into heaven. So, in other words, the temple tower of Babylon is portrayed as a human made attempt to recreate Eden, the original temple mountain where heaven and earth overlapped. Because remember from our previous studies, you had the heavens, right? This is how the ancients saw it. You had the heavens and you had the earth, and Eden was portrayed as overlapping between these two realms. So, could have been that humanity is trying to get back into Eden. So, the idea that the foundation of Babylon was a joint human spiritual rebellion is also made clear by the portrayal of the ruler of Babylon in Isaiah 14, which looks back at Genesis 10 through 11. So remember how we considered humans trying to get their way back into heaven, right? Tower of Babylon. But could it be that they were also being influenced by the spiritual rebels who were cast out too? So we can see this in Isaiah 14. You all will take this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased and how fury has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. So in this poem from Isaiah 14, Isaiah depicts the king of Babylon as a human rebel who is embodying the career of the spiritual rebel behind the origins of Babylon. So the fact that Babylon was founded by Nimrod, a warrior giant associated with the Nephilim, and then built up as an anti-Eden in Genesis 11, shows the author of Isaiah that Babylon is more than just a human enterprise. It is a joint enterprise between humans who are rebelling and sons of God who are also rebelling as well. It's a joint effort. So here are some conclusions we see with spiritual and human evil from Genesis 1 through 11 and with the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. We see that Genesis 1 through 11, we see multiple spiritual and human rebellions that are all intertwined. So Genesis 3 through 4, the original spiritual rebel, the snake, is a former exalted throne guardian. He's considered a cherubim or seraphim, right? This was a throne guardian of God's heavenly temple. And this being resents being subservient, being under exalted humans. So what does this being decide to do? He lures Adam and Eve into the same temptation which he succumbed to, right? He wanted to be like God. He wanted to be above God, just like the humans did. So he offered the same temptation, and he seized authority by his own wisdom, and he abused it for selfish purposes. So when we then watch humans replay this rebellion, first with Adam and Eve, and then with Cain murdering his brother Abel. Okay? In Genesis 6 through 11, we see even more members of the divine council, right? Because remember, God has a heavenly staff team, right? And some of them decided to rebel. And when they rebelled, it's an intensification of the Genesis 3 rebellion. It's a bigger rebellion. So this results in the spread of creatures, beings, who are part spiritual being, part human, right? These Nephilim, these giants, who spread violence throughout their empires, beginning with Babylon. And as many of these beings die in the flood, their spirits live in the underworld as terrifying monsters, which we explored as the Rephaim. So these categories, right? The arch rebel, the lower level spiritual rebels, and the deceased spirits of the Nephilim, they're developed throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Bible. So the arch rebel, he can be depicted as, this is the snake whom we often see. This arch rebel can be depicted as a sea dragon. We see this in Isaiah 27, or a dangerous desert creature in Psalm 94, or Moloch, a spirit king of the grave. This is described in Leviticus 18 and 20, or is an accusing lawyer in the divine court. Remember the Hasatan, the Satan in Job, who comes before God's throne room. So all of these references are Mosaic-like, and they portray this arch rebel who continues in the New Testament. And he's also, or this being is also described in Revelation 12:9. Here, Revelation 12:9. And the great dragon was thrown down, and the snake of old, who is called the devil and the Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Look at Exodus 12. Let's continue onwards. We're not in Exodus 12. The rebel divine council members deceive the nations. This is category 2. Deceive the nations into worshiping them, resulting in injustice and in violence. We see this in Psalm 82 and Isaiah 24. So these rebel council members, right, who were also thrown down with the Satan, these are the gods of the other nations mentioned in the Old Testament. For example, the gods of Egypt, whom God defeats in Exodus, right? And we remember that story from Sunday school. Remember with the plagues, how each time God would send a plague, he was making fun of an Egyptian god. So here, every time God triumphed, like the darkness, the meteor, the fire coming out of the sky, taking of the firstborn, all those plagues were making fun of these other gods, of these other rebel divine council members who had gone against God, but who are now ruling over these nations. So look at it from Exodus 12. This is God speaking. For I will go throughout the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Look at Deuteronomy 4. And beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and stars, all the host of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. To the other rebel council members. The word demon appears in the Old Testament 2 times to refer to this group of spiritual rebels. Notice they are identified with the gods worshipped by the nations. In Deuteronomy 32, they made God jealous with foreign gods. With the abominations, they provoked God to anger. They sacrificed to demons who were not God, to gods whom they had not known, new gods who came lately. It's Psalm 106. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Okay, so we are now moving on, and we have done the Old Testament. Now we're going to look at spiritual evil in the New Testament. This is much more familiar to us. So first we have the Satan or the slanderer. Okay. Now we begin these notes exploring Jesus' encounter with a spiritual rebel in the Gospels. We can recognize in the figure of the Satan or the slanderer is the same one depicted as the snake in Genesis 3, as a dragon in Isaiah 27, and as a ruler of death in Leviticus 18 and 20. So Jesus' testing in the wilderness in Matthew 4, remember, is a replay of Adam and Eve's test in the garden. And notice that the Satan offers Jesus a version of Babylon. Look at Matthew 4. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to them, all these things I will give to you if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Now, the Satan is Jesus' primary enemy in the Gospels. From the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus knows that all humanity has given its allegiance to various forms of Babylonian and idolatry, exalting human-made empires, economies, and gods to divine status. So this rebellion is both on an individual level and on a corporate level, human and spiritual, which is why he viewed his confrontation with the leaders of Jerusalem as a battle against the powers of darkness. So look at Luke 22. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and the elders who had come against him, have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay your hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours. So these powers are described in Paul's letters a lot. In Paul's letters, the rebel members of the divine council are referred to as the powers and authorities, who attract the allegiance and idolatrous worship of societies on political, cultural, and religious levels. Let's look at Ephesians 2. The age of this world, the ruler of the authority of the air, the spirit who is now working among the sons of disobedience. At Ephesians 3, the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realm. Look at Ephesians 6. Not flesh and blood, but the rulers, authorities, and the cosmic powers of this present darkness, the evil spiritual beings in the heavenly realm. Look at Colossians 1. All things were created in him, things in the heavens and the things on earth, the visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created in him and for him. Oops. Colossians 2. They take you away captive through philosophies and empty deception in accordance with human traditions and the elemental powers of the cosmos, not in accordance with the Messiah. Colossians 2:15. After disarming the rulers and authorities, Jesus exposed them to public shame, triumphing over them. After disarming the rulers and authorities, he exposed them to public shame, triumphing over them in the Messiah. Or look at Galatians. Jesus, Messiah, who gave himself on behalf of our sins in order to rescue us from the present evil age. In Galatians 4, we were enslaved under the elemental powers of the cosmos. Galatians 4, verses 8 through 9. You were enslaved to what by nature were not gods, the weak and impoverished elemental powers. In 1 Corinthians, this age, the rulers of this age who are passing away, the rulers of this age who, if they did know the wisdom of God, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Look at 1 Corinthians 15. When the Messiah hands over the kingdom to God the Father, when he nullifies every rule and authority and power, for it is necessary that he rule until he has placed all enemies under his feet, the last enemy to be nullified is death. But look at Romans 8. Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor the present, nor the future, nor powers, nor anything in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Messiah Jesus our Lord. So, there's a lot thrown at y'all. Bruce Lawnecker, he sums up Paul's understanding pretty succinctly in his book called The Triumph of Abraham's God. He says, Paul considers the celestial bodies, which are also called the elements in Galatians 4, to be personalized spiritual forces of some kind, supernatural beings that hold power over human beings. He has in mind the tribal deities that were thought to oversee the nations on behalf of God, which we saw in Deuteronomy 32. But this purpose deteriorated. These same regulating beings are what is meant in Ephesians as cosmokratoros. It's a fancy word for cosmic rulers, okay? But the metaphor in this word contains an ambiguity. On the one hand, they are said to be able to hold the world, okay? Hold the world, administering justice and order on behalf of God, because that's what they were originally called to do, right? Talked about that early in the study. But on the other hand, this holding that they have can easily become a grab in which they seek to detract attention from the true creator God and establish themselves as the ultimate in divine power and authority. These are the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So what about demons and evil spirits? So when Jesus goes about announcing the good news of the kingdom of God, he regularly confronts spiritual beings that terrorize individual humans physically and mentally. These illnesses are attributed to spiritual evil beings. So look at Matthew 4. Jesus was going through all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. The news about him spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains, those under demon oppression, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. Now notice how in Matthew 4 we have list of ills which combine demon oppression in a list that we would consider in our modern world as medical or mental illnesses. Now, this is odd for us because we don't share the same view as biblical authors. In the biblical imagination, anything that degrades the human person, sickness, death, mental instability, bodily malfunction, are all attributed to spiritual forces of death and the grave. So that's one thing we have to be aware of, okay? We're not saying that there aren't any spiritual beings. It's just that now we have understanding that maybe someone is mentally ill, maybe they're not oppressed by a demonic force. So one of the most common titles for these evil spiritual beings, these evil spirits, is called impure spirits. And we could see this in Matthew 10, Matthew 12, Mark 3, 5, 8, 13, 6, 7, and 9. You could see this attributed a lot, impure spirits. Look at one example from Mark 1. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an impure spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. So notice in Mark 1, what we just read, notice how this spirit, who's singular, speaks as if it is a collection of multiple spiritual beings. Remember what he asked? Have you come to destroy us? So this spiritual rebel is called impure because in the biblical storyline, these spirits are associated with the Rephaim, which we mentioned earlier, the inhabitants of the realm of the dead warrior kings of old. So in biblical Jewish thought, the bodies of the dead are thought to be ritually impure. Okay, you didn't associate with it. You didn't associate with the dead because they considered it impure. They thought it would taint you. They thought it would corrupt you. They thought you wouldn't be clean in the presence of God if you associated with these things. So The bodies of the dead are ritually impure, and we can see this from Leviticus 14 through 15. So, if a spiritual being is the remnant of the dead warrior giants, they are, by definition, ritually impure. So, one of the impure spirits that Jesus faces, which we saw in Mark, which we'll see in Mark 5, have a very clear connection to the Rephaim. Let's look at Mark 5. When Jesus got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an impure spirit met him, and he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gnashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So this spiritual rebel is both singular and plural. He says, "We are many." He terrorizes a poor guy in a graveyard, and he's named after a Roman battalion, Legion. So perhaps we are meant to see that Jesus is facing a battalion of Rephaim in a ritually impure location. Because what they're by the tombs, the realm of the dead, yet Jesus is victorious over them. So Jesus has power, ultimate power over spiritual evil. In Luke's version of Jesus being tested in the wilderness, he includes a short comment after Jesus overcomes the spiritual rebel, after he overcomes the Satan. Now, this comment casts a shadow over the entire narrative of the Gospel of Luke. And we are meant to see Jesus' rising conflict with the leaders of Jerusalem and his arrival there for Passover as a spiritual conflict. So Luke 4:13. When the slanderer had finished every test, he left Jesus until the time. Till the time. He left him alone for a little while. So when Jesus went out announcing the arrival of God's kingdom, demons and spiritual evil were subservient to him and his disciples. Right? We see this in the Gospels. We see this in Mark 1. And they were amazed, so they debated among themselves. This is the disciples saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the impure spirits, and they obey him." Immediately the news about him spread everywhere. Or look at Matthew 10. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over impure spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. So remember, Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, right? Then the adversary goes away for a little while, right? But then it is only when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem that he intentionally yields himself to the powers of evil, right? Through his arrest, through his crucifixion. He does this in order to let them inspire his sham trial and his execution. So at every step, Jesus is fully aware that the Sanhedrin, Pontius Pilate, and the Roman soldiers are all captive to the powers of cosmic evil that drive their behavior. So look at Luke 22. "While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay your hands on me, but this hour, the power of darkness are yours." Or look at John 12. "Now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death which he was about to die. So here's some conclusions about spiritual evil in the New Testament. Okay? The categories of spiritual evil in the New Testament map closely the portrait we find in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. The conflict is between Yahweh, our God, and the spiritual rebellion in the human Bible is carried forward by Jesus in his announcement of the arrival of God's kingdom. Now, N.T. Wright sums this up very well. He says, Paul's vision of the ultimate rescue of the entire created order, a vision which flowed directly from what he believed about the Messiah, about Jesus, impelled him to understand evil as a whole, which was more than the sum total of human sins or deaths. Rather, sin and death were themselves suprahuman forces bent on corrupting and destroying the Creator's good world. Okay, so based on Paul's language about the powers, and the promise is both personal, the heart is infected by sin, corrupting the mind into idolatry, and the person into dehumanizing behavior, and cosmic, since the worship of idols allows the demons who masquerade behind them to gain power that is not rightfully theirs. Sin and death have replaced, in Paul's mind, the wicked, idolatrous pagans as seen from within his pre-Christian worldview. So sin and death are the real enemies which had to be defeated. And indeed, they have been defeated on the cross and will be defeated fully in Jesus' final coming. So summed up, the climax of Jesus' liberation war against the powers of spiritual evil in his arrest, execution, and resurrection. This, what Jesus does through his arrest, execution, and resurrection, is how he overcomes the powers of evil which rule over this world. Well, I appreciate everyone joining us for our study, and we really appreciate y'all, and we'll see y'all later. Goodbye.